And now back to our top story. CBS News has obtained a newly released audio recording that could be a key piece of evidence in the federal government's case against Donald Trump. In it, we can hear the former president discussing secret documents at his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey. So Catherine Herridge is in Washington with more on this. Catherine, good morning.
Good morning, Anne-Marie. In the 2-minute audio recording, the former president denounces his former top military advisor, General Mark Milley, and appears to share what he describes as highly confidential and secret information involving a Defense Department plan of attack on Iran. And in the indictment, he's accused of showing the records to a small group, apparently with no security clearance.
He said he wanted to attack Iran and what? These are the papers. This was done by the military and given to me.
A newly obtained audio recording may be a key piece of evidence in special counsel Jack Smith's case that alleges former President Trump put national security at risk by mishandling classified documents, including one he suggested was prepared by Joint Chiefs Chair General Mark Milley.
All right, guys, Adam is here, so let's get started. Beneath the culture war distractions, Trump's coalition is visibly fracturing in real time, and the evidence is now so overwhelming that even devoted loyalists can no longer convincingly pretend everything is fine. The conservative youth movement suffered a catastrophic blow when its most dynamic leader was taken in an instant that nobody saw coming. He was 31 years old, young enough to connect with college students but seasoned enough to have built an organization that reached into high schools and campuses across the entire country. His name had become shorthand for a particular style of confrontational conservatism that thrived on viral moments and fearless debates.
Let's return to that breaking news this hour that the conservative commentator Charlie Kirk has been shot at an event at a university in Utah, the Utah Valley University. That's according to an NBC News reporter on social media. The spokesperson at the university told NBC News that Kirk was giving a presentation when shots were fired and said that to the best of our knowledge, he was hit and taken with his security team away from the premises. Now,
when he walked onto a stage, young people who had felt politically homeless suddenly found someone who spoke their language without apology and without the stiffness of traditional politicians. He was the personality that Turning Point USA had been constructed around, the irreplaceable center of gravity that made the entire enterprise work. The tragedy happened at an event that was supposed to be routine, just another stop on a relentless schedule of campus activism. In an instant, the movement lost not just a leader, but the specific chemistry that had made its youth outreach so effective.
Conservative political activist Charlie Kirk is dead after being shot at a rally at a university in Utah. Our Sabrina Franz has been following this for us. And Sabrina, Kirk was from the Chicago suburbs.
Marie, he was, and he was best known as the co-founder of Turning Point USA, a conservative nonprofit that focused on engaging college and high school students, and he was doing just that at that university when he was shot and killed earlier today. He leaves behind a wife and 2 young children. Now, here's a look at Kirk just moments before the shooting, passing out hats with the number 47 on it, of course, a nod to his support of President Trump there. He was sitting under a tent, as we mentioned, taking questions from the crowd. We will not be showing the actual shooting, of course, but it was under that tent when he was hit in the neck. Police did take a suspect into custody, but that person has since been released. Witnesses ran from the scene in the aftermath.
His widow took the helm, stepping into a role that nobody could have prepared for, carrying the dual burden of personal devastation and institutional responsibility. She has done everything humanly possible to keep the machinery running, appearing at events, delivering remarks, honoring the mission that her husband had dedicated his life to building. But the harsh truth that nobody wants to state publicly is that organizations built around singular personalities rarely survive the loss of their founders.
ABC 15 continues to follow the very latest after the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. Today, the organization he co-founded, Turning Point, named Kirk's wife, Erica, their new CEO and chair of the board. The group saying in their social media post that their prior discussions with Charlie Kirk told us multiple executives that this is, quote, what he wanted in the event of his death.
The magic was never in the mission statement or the organizational chart. The magic was in the person, and the person is gone. The crowds that once packed auditoriums have noticeably thinned. The viral energy that used to generate millions of impressions organically has become harder to manufacture. Young conservatives who were activated by the founders' unique ability to make conservatism feel rebellious and exciting are finding it more difficult to sustain their engagement without the figure who made it all feel urgent and alive. The infrastructure remains. The staff shows up to work. The events still happen. But the soul that animated the whole enterprise departed on that tragic day, and rebuilding around a different personality is a task that may take years rather than months. Now let me paint you a picture of something that would have been unthinkable during the movement's peak. A church in Phoenix, chosen deliberately to host a rally that was meant to demonstrate the enduring power of the movement's appeal. The advance team had done their work. The promotion had blanketed the region. Every expectation was for the kind of overflow crowd that had become the movement's signature visual, the proof that conventional wisdom about declining enthusiasm was wrong. But when the cameras swept across the congregation, the empty spaces told a story that no amount of stagecraft could hide. The venue could hold thousands more than actually showed up. Independent video documentation captured the same reality from multiple angles. The reporting confirmed what the images showed. The gap between expectation and reality was too large to explain away with traffic patterns or weather forecasts. These rallies have always been more than just events. They have been the most visible barometer of political strength, the tangible counter-argument to polling data that suggested weakness. When the crowds were massive and the energy was electric, supporters could point to those images and say that the numbers didn't capture the movement's true power. But now the visual evidence aligns with the polling in a way that creates a reinforcing cycle of diminished expectations. Party officials who once built their entire strategies around assumptions of passionate base turnout are now having uncomfortable conversations about whether those assumptions still hold. The crack that has become impossible to ignore appeared during what should have been a predictably friendly conversation on a network that had long served as a reliable platform for the movement's message. The host had built her career partly on providing sympathetic coverage, asking the kind of questions that allowed the administration to speak directly to its supporters without facing uncomfortable scrutiny. But something shifted during an exchange about foreign workers and American jobs. When the assertion was made that domestic talent simply didn't exist to fill certain positions, the host did something that sent shockwaves through the entire conservative media ecosystem. She pushed back directly and without hesitation, repeating her disagreement with a forcefulness that made clear this wasn't a rhetorical flourish or a minor quibble. The words she used were simple but devastating. A direct contradiction delivered twice in rapid succession, a moment of televised dissent that immediately began ricocheting across every social media platform. The viral explosion that followed demonstrated something that the movement's leaders had been trying to ignore. The base was hungry for permission to acknowledge doubts that had been building for months. Millions of views, countless shares, and a conversation that refused to die regardless of efforts to redirect attention elsewhere. The moment crystallized what had been lurking beneath the surface ever since the campaign season ended. The coalition that had appeared monolithic and unshakable was actually a fragile arrangement of competing interests held together by personality and the promise of shared success. When the successes became harder to identify and the economic pain became harder to dismiss, the forces pulling the coalition apart began to overwhelm the forces holding it together. Conservative media figures who had once maintained careful alignment with every administration position began finding their own voices on the immigration and labor question. A prominent commentator on a conservative network offered analysis that landed closer to the host's skepticism than to the official line. A Florida political figure with significant grassroots credibility warned publicly about a catastrophic trajectory, using language that would have been unthinkable during the period of maximum coalition discipline. These were not fringe figures with no following. These were respected voices within the movement, concluding that loyalty had limits when policy outcomes were actively harming the constituents who formed the movement's foundation. The administration's response to these defections was entirely predictable and deeply revealing. Social media posts targeted specific conservative figures who had expressed disagreement. A Fox News contributor found herself named and attacked on the platform that served as the direct communication channel to the base. The strategy was transparent to anyone paying attention: make an example of the dissenters to discourage others from following their lead. But the strategy also exposed the underlying weakness because resilient coalitions don't need to constantly discipline their own members. When every disagreement becomes a loyalty test, the tests eventually start producing more failures than successes. Some of the targeted figures adjusted their public statements to avoid further conflict. Others, however, continued expressing their disagreements despite the attacks, calculating that their credibility with their specific audiences mattered more than perfect alignment with every policy position. This created an impossible situation for those tasked with maintaining coalition unity. Allowing public disagreements to continue signaled to voters that the coalition wasn't unified. Escalating the attacks drew more attention to the disagreements and risked alienating the supporters who followed the dissenting voices. The online ecosystem that had been the movement's greatest strategic advantage began transforming into a landscape of internal warfare. The immigration and labor debate exposed fault lines that had existed since the beginning but had been carefully papered over during the urgency of the campaign. The debate over military engagement in the Middle East pitted traditional hawks against a growing faction that questioned whether American lives should be sacrificed in foreign conflicts with no clear endpoint. Economic policy discussions revealed the tension between business interests that benefited from particular trade arrangements and working-class consumers who were absorbing the costs of higher prices. Each of these debates played out in full public view, with competing factions claiming to represent the authentic spirit of the movement while accusing rivals of betraying fundamental principles. The strategists responsible for navigating these treacherous waters faced an increasingly impossible assignment. Enforcing coalition discipline meant suppressing the very discussions that the base was demanding. Permitting those discussions meant exposing internal contradictions that the opposition could weaponize. Every online argument, every public disagreement between previously aligned voices, every viral clip of a trusted figure expressing doubt contributed to a narrative of fragmentation that was becoming impossible to reverse regardless of how much money was spent on counter-messaging. The polling data tracking this decline painted a brutal picture that aligned with disturbing precision alongside the anecdotal evidence. National approval numbers had fallen into territory that historically signals significant midterm losses for the party in power. Multiple surveys using different methodologies converged on the same range, showing support hovering in the mid-30s. A respected polling operation showed net approval submerged deep in negative territory, with disapproval exceeding approval by double-digit margins. Every competitive state that had been crucial to the previous victory now showed the incumbent underwater, sometimes by margins that indicated structural problems rather than temporary dissatisfaction that could be corrected with better messaging. The economic indicators driving this collapse were specific and measurable, not vague sentiments or media-manufactured narratives. Government data showed inflation persisting stubbornly above target levels, eroding household budgets in ways that no amount of rhetorical spin could disguise. Analysis from prestigious research institutions demonstrated that specific policy choices, particularly regarding international trade, had added measurable costs to everyday purchases that families could not avoid. Effective tariff rates had multiplied several times over, and those increased costs flowed directly into the prices families encountered at grocery stores and retail outlets. One economic analysis calculated that typical households were paying substantially more for essential goods each year, while any benefits from tax adjustments were completely consumed by the increased costs. The net effect was a measurable decline in purchasing power for the working families who had been promised economic relief as the primary justification for their political support. The grocery bill became the most potent political symbol of this dynamic because it was the one economic indicator that every voter experienced multiple times each week. When major polling organizations found that nearly two-thirds of Americans directly connected their higher grocery costs to administration policies, that represented a political liability that no rally speech could overcome. People can rationalize abstract economic statistics indefinitely, but they cannot rationalize the experience of watching their money purchase less at the checkout counter week after week. The situation in traditionally reliable strongholds told an even more alarming story for those tasked with maintaining the coalition's electoral position. A state that had served as the electoral foundation for decades, a place where the political culture seemed almost genetically programmed to resist opposition messaging, showed approval numbers slipping into negative territory. This was not a competitive state where close margins were the historical norm. This was bedrock territory, the place where the movement's message was supposed to resonate most powerfully and where demographic trends were supposed to provide an unbreachable firewall against decline. When favorability swung from comfortably positive to uncomfortably negative in such a foundational state, it signaled that something fundamental had shifted in ways that traditional political defenses could not contain. Special elections in districts that had been reliably safe for the movement's candidates began producing results that sent tremors through the political class. Seats that had been held comfortably for years flipped to the opposition, sometimes by margins that suggested a fundamental realignment rather than a temporary protest. Each result provided additional data about district-level dynamics, and the cumulative pattern pointed toward an electoral environment far more treacherous than the midterm losses that typically afflict governing parties. The military dimension added another layer of complexity to the coalition's challenges. A major overseas operation launched with great fanfare had generated consequences that rippled through American communities in tangible and painful ways. Gas prices spiked as global energy markets absorbed the instability. Diesel costs rose, affecting agriculture, shipping, and the price of virtually every physical good that moved through the supply chain. American service members had made the ultimate sacrifice, and many more had returned bearing wounds both visible and invisible. Each casualty notification sent shockwaves through military communities and veteran organizations that had been reliable reservoirs of support. Veterans who had extended trust to the administration on matters of war and peace began reassessing that trust as the costs accumulated and the strategic objectives remained frustratingly distant. The casualty figures affected not only the families directly impacted, but the broader community of former service members who understood the moral weight of sending young Americans into harm's way. Polling that tracked veteran sentiment showed declining confidence in leadership, and veterans represent a constituency with unique moral standing on questions of military engagement. Their doubts carried particular weight with civilian supporters who looked to veterans for guidance on national security matters. The organizational infrastructure that had been instrumental to the movement's previous success faced its own parallel crisis. The youth organization that had mobilized millions of young conservatives was navigating a leadership transition without its founders' irreplaceable abilities. The conferences that had once drawn thousands of fired-up young activists were struggling to achieve comparable scale. The campus presence that had made the organization a defining feature of conservative youth culture was harder to sustain without the confrontational energy that had characterized its founders' approach. Young conservatives who had been activated during the movement's ascent found themselves with diminished institutional support for their continued engagement. Everything converged to create a political environment fundamentally different from the one that had produced the movement's previous victory. Republican candidates facing voters confronted an excruciating strategic dilemma with no clean resolution. They could embrace the administration and its policies, which meant associating themselves with approval numbers that were underwater in their districts and economic conditions that were hurting their constituents in measurable ways. Alternatively, they could create distance, which meant risking the alienation of base supporters whose enthusiasm was essential for turnout. Either path generated electoral vulnerability, and the calculation about which vulnerability was less dangerous varied from district to district in ways that made national coordination nearly impossible. The defenders of the coalition, and there remain many who believe deeply in its founding principles, offer arguments that merit honest engagement. They observe accurately that approval polls taken at this stage of an administration have limited predictive power for eventual election outcomes. Historical precedents exist of administrations that recovered from similarly bleak numbers to avoid devastating midterm losses. They contend that internal disagreements are normal features of any broad political coalition with diverse constituencies, and that the visibility of these disagreements partly reflects media coverage decisions rather than fundamental structural weakness. They suggest that local factors particular to specific venues or events might account for attendance figures that seem to indicate waning enthusiasm. They express confidence that the new leadership of the youth organization is building toward successes that have not yet been captured by headlines focused on loss rather than renewal. They maintain that approval will recover as specific policy benefits become visible to voters currently focused on transitional costs. These are fair points that any honest analyst must take seriously. Polls are snapshots, not prophecies. Coalitions argue internally all the time without collapsing. Local circumstances matter. Leadership transitions require patience. Public opinion can shift rapidly when underlying conditions change. No serious observer would dismiss these arguments entirely. But the defense collapses under the weight of its own cumulative burden. The difficulty is not any single indicator pointing toward trouble. The difficulty is that every independent indicator, measured by different organizations using different methodologies and examining different aspects of the political landscape, converges on the same conclusion. The national approval figures from multiple pollsters cluster in the same troubling range. The competitive state numbers exhibit consistent weakness rather than isolated problems. The economic data from government statistical agencies and independent research institutions tells a coherent story about costs being imposed on American households. The visual evidence from public events aligns with what the surveys predict. The internal disagreements among coalition voices follow a pattern that reflects underlying policy tensions rather than personality clashes. The special election results provide real-world validation of what the polls indicate about voter sentiment. When an honest person examines the full picture without filtering it through partisan preferences, the conclusion that emerges is straightforward and difficult to dispute. The coalition that achieved victory is undergoing structural fragmentation that impairs its ability to govern, to message, to mobilize, and to compete effectively. This fragmentation is not a media fabrication or an opposition fantasy. It is documented through reporting from multiple organizations, recorded in videos that anyone can watch, expressed in public statements from the coalition's own prominent figures, measured in polling data from respected institutions, and visible in election results that have already occurred. The question that matters going forward is not whether the fragmentation exists, but what it means for the political contests ahead. Democratic candidates in competitive races perceive opportunity in the data. Independent challengers see openings created by voter dissatisfaction with the options currently available. Republican candidates who can preserve some separation from the most controversial policies enjoy relative advantage over those who cannot. Voters benefit from possessing accurate information about the condition of political coalitions as they make decisions about who merits their support. The personal consequences for the central figure in this drama are substantial. Coalition fragmentation reduces political maneuverability, making it harder to pressure allies into alignment and harder to claim a mandate for controversial decisions. The organizational consequences for the youth movement are equally serious. An institution that once appeared on the verge of generational influence now faces questions about whether its defining moment has passed. The fundraising and strategic consequences for the broader party apparatus ripple through every decision about where to deploy resources and which candidates to support. Several scenarios could unfold from this point. The fragmentation could continue accelerating through the next election cycle, producing losses that necessitate a fundamental reassessment of the coalition's approach. Additional public disagreements could emerge on other policy issues, generating new flashpoints that further complicate coalition management. Additional special elections could supply more data about whether the patterns already observed represent temporary fluctuations or sustained shifts. The decisions candidates make about whether to run and how to position themselves will shape the options available to voters. The post-election period could witness the coalition restructuring itself around different priorities or different personalities, depending on the magnitude of whatever losses materialize. The deeper question that all of this raises extends beyond any particular election cycle or any particular personality. American political coalitions function through an ongoing negotiation between different constituencies who share some objectives while diverging on others. The health of these coalitions depends on their capacity to manage internal tensions through honest dialogue, mutual respect, and a shared commitment to broader purposes that transcend individual policy disagreements. When coalition discipline becomes the overriding priority, suppressing legitimate debate in favor of enforced conformity, the coalition forfeits the adaptability that allows it to respond to changing circumstances. When personality becomes the sole unifying force, the coalition becomes vulnerable to whatever happens to that personality. The documented pattern of fragmentation represents a test of whether the coalition can evolve beyond its original construction or whether it was too dependent on specific factors that cannot be replicated. The empty seats in Phoenix, the viral moment of public disagreement on a friendly network, the dissenting voices from within the movement's own media infrastructure, the polling numbers that show declining support across every measurable category, the economic data that demonstrates real costs being absorbed by real families, the military casualties that weigh on the national conscience, the organizational struggles of institutions built around individual charisma. Each of these threads contributes to a tapestry that depicts a coalition under strain from forces it cannot fully control. The truth that emerges from all of this documentation is that political movements are living entities that require constant nurturing, honest self-assessment, and the flexibility to adapt when circumstances change. Movements that depend too heavily on the force of personality eventually encounter the limits of that personality. Movements that suppress internal debate eventually face the explosion of tensions that were never genuinely resolved. Movements that lose touch with the material conditions of their supporters' lives eventually face the judgment of those supporters at the ballot box. The receipts are available for anyone willing to examine them honestly. The bills that families are paying each month. The shopping trips that cost more than they did before. The casualty notifications that arrive at military families' doors, the half-empty venues that once overflowed with passionate supporters, all of it is visible to the voters who will render decisions in upcoming elections, and all of it is visible to the coalition members who once believed they were part of an unstoppable force. At its core, this entire story is about whether the political dynamics that produced one of the most surprising victories in modern American history can be sustained through the grinding reality of governance. It is about whether a coalition built around shared opposition to the established order can maintain cohesion when it becomes the established order. It is about whether voters will continue supporting leaders whose policies generate measurable costs in their daily lives in exchange for cultural victories that are more difficult to quantify. It is about whether organizations built around individual genius can survive the loss of their founders. It is about whether internal criticism is treated as betrayal or as the healthy functioning of a mature political movement. The fragmentation documented across multiple independent sources, through multiple methodologies, across multiple domains of political life is not partisan interpretation. It is the observable reality of a political moment in transition. The national approval figures in the mid-30s, the net approval deep in negative territory, the competitive states all underwater, the grocery price perceptions cutting across demographic lines, the special election losses in formerly safe districts, the internal disagreements playing out in public view, the rally attendance that no longer matches previous levels, the organizational transitions that have not yet found their equilibrium. All of it is documented. All of it is verifiable. All of it points toward a political environment that has shifted in ways that will generate consequences in upcoming elections, regardless of how anyone feels about those consequences. The political coalition that once seemed invincible is discovering that invincibility was always partly an illusion created by temporary circumstances that no longer apply. The question now is not whether the fragmentation will continue, but how the various actors in this drama will respond to it, what new alignments will emerge from it, and what the American political landscape will look like when the current period of transition gives way to whatever comes next. The only certainty is that the patterns already established will continue generating new data points that either confirm or complicate the trajectory that the existing evidence suggests. The receipts are accumulating, the bills are coming due, and the voters are paying attention in ways that will become unmistakably clear when the next votes are counted.